we'll go ahead and dive in. Lots of stuff on the agenda for today. But before we did that, just wanted to poll the usual suspects here. Next fall, we don't have anything planned. Last year we did Old Testament, which was kind of medium prep for me. This year we did History of the Church, which has taken a little more prep than average, which is fine. But next year I'd like to do something with a little more easier prep, which would mean going through a book of scripture. So we don't have to decide today, but think about what scriptural books you might be interested in doing a deeper dive into, and we'll think about that for the fall. So if that's amenable to everybody, that's a little easier prep because the text is set, and then you just can work through it.
What have you done in the past?
I can do anything in his dog. Anything is on the table. You know, and some things. Leviticus, yeah. If you want to be really excited, we can do Leviticus. Actually, the guy across the street at the other seminary, was a Leviticus expert. Wolfgang Roth. I've got a book by Wolfgang Roth on Leviticus. But okay, we'll be thinking about that. But you know, we've done all the Gospels, we've done Revelation, but anything's on the table. So, all right, well, today we're going to be looking at America. We've been looking at the 19th century in continental Europe, and last week in Britain, because a lot went on in Britain during the 19th century. But this year, we're coming back to our side of the pond. And remember, the long 19th century is kind of 1789-ish to 1914-ish. And we talked about last time that, technological change, Greeks and Romans used sails and horses for transport, and they were still doing that. Ben Franklin was using sails and horses for transport. That would change. We talked last week about the steam engine and the rapid technological change, the most technologically changed, rapidly developed, technologically advanced century in the history of the world until the ones that followed it, 19th and 20th and 21st century. And we talked last week about Britain, especially since they adopted the Industrial Revolution so early. We would have all these same issues later, but they really dealt with them 70, 80, 100 years earlier than we did in America, depending on what part of America we're talking about. But urbanization, pollution, child and female labor, not quite as much of a problem for us, but some. Standard of living by the clock, the factory clock, and whistle instead of by the sun, and losing that agricultural sense. All right, so certainly that's a part of the long 19th century in America. But we've got another unique piece that's distinctive to us. This is also for us the great period of westward expansion, and that in many ways defines our country's history and the religious history of this time period. So just a quick review. Remember, you had the Appalachian Mountains, the 13 colonies really didn't cross the Appalachians. In theory, their borders did, but the British said, don't cross those mountains. Well, some people did. Daniel Boone, kept leading folks across into Kentucky to settle, and that was illegal. And I never figured out as a kid why Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett had the same hat and was played by the same guy. But anyway, Fess Parker knows. But Daniel Boone was a big man. But they did cross over into, certainly once the revolution happened, after Britain was no longer stopping any kind of settlement west of the Appalachians, all bets were off, and the floodgates basically opened. And don't forget, Daniel Boone didn't die in Kentucky. He lived the last 21 years of his life west of the Mississippi in what we would call suburban St. Louis. His old farms. And so, I mean, he didn't just cross the mountains, he crossed the Mississippi eventually and died an old man in the 1820s in Missouri. Or, we in our part of the world, we think of Davy Crockett and Sam Houston, a couple of Tennesseans who pushed west into Texas. Or this is always remarkable to me. Think about 1803. Lewis and Clark set off on a 3-year trip, 2 years out, basically 1 year back. They stopped during the winters. Folks didn't even know if they were alive. I mean, they went off the grid. When we sent men to the moon, they were almost in constant contact, except when they were on the backside of the moon. Lewis and Clark just disappeared and then showed back up 3 years later with all these exciting discoveries. 3 years in 1803 out and back. By the 1840s, the Oregon Trail was established, and women and children were walking it in 6 months. Okay, yeah, there were problems at times. You get a snowstorm in the past and, some would die, but, that's a remarkable change right there. And then 1850, California was made a state. Well, there was gold there, so that kind of rushed things along. But California was a state before Minnesota and Kansas were. So, I mean, that's remarkable to me. And then by 1869, right after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad opened, and you go from 3 years to 4 days. We can't to just think about that in 66 years to go from a 3-year trek. There'll be an 8-day trek there and back round trip, but that's a remarkable change of pace there. And so just rapid expansion westward. Or I always think of my favorite movie example of this, Debbie Reynolds, and How the West Was Won. She's a young girl going on the riverboat down the Ohio River to settle the far west in Illinois. And as the old lady at the end of the movie, she's setting up on her kid's ranch in Arizona. I mean, just this is basically one lifetime we're talking, all this stuff happening. A long lifetime for some people. All right, so westward expansion. There's an old joke here, and the joke is this. The Baptists move west on foot. The Methodists move west on horseback. The Presbyterians move west via railroads, and the Episcopalians waited for first-class Pullman car service. It's not quite true, but the Methodists and the Baptists were quick out of the chute, getting across the mountains. The Episcopalians were very slow. We didn't get across really settling the West until the 1830s. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Presbyterians actually moved a little bit quicker than waiting for railroads too, but there is some truth in this. Certainly the Baptists and Methodists were the first ones to really head west and try to preach the gospel to all those heathen settlers that are on the frontier.
Why were we so slow?
Let's talk about that when we get to the 1830s here. It's a good question. But let's talk about the Great Cane Ridge Revival and outside of Lexington, suburban Lexington today. 1801, the first great American revival. Now we had the Great Awakening in the late 1700s, but what we think of as kind of the big American tent revival, people coming from all kinds of places. This is the first one, 1801. Gigantic meeting. It actually was at a Presbyterian church, but most of the folks that came, most of the clergy participating were Methodists and Baptists. So there was a log cabin Presbyterian church, supposedly the largest log cabin ever built in the Americas. Giant log church, but this group was still too big for that. So Methodists and Baptist preachers, people, they estimated 20,000 people came during the week, probably 10,000 max at any one given day. But that was 10% of the people in Kentucky at the time. So it drew an enormous chunk of the population to this revival. Big camp meeting. I mean, and it ticked off all the things that we would think of being part of a camp meeting, camp revival. Dedicating your life to Jesus, singing song, all those kind of things. This was the first, the big first one. Would you grab me a Kleenex, please? Thanks. Or napkin. And this really started what was called the Second Great Awakening. I put that term up at the top there. First Great Awakening, 1730s, 1740s, but this Second Great Awakening, early 1800s, really until the 1830s, 40s. Big movement, especially west of the Appalachians. So after Cane Ridge, revivals became the norm, and revivalism as a movement spread up and down the mountain chain on the west side of the Appalachians. Revivalism spread all the way up into western New York and well down into the deep south. In fact, by the 1820s, they had so many revivals in western New York, they called it the Burnt Over District. We've had so many fires of the Spirit burn here that do we have anything left? Do we have anybody left unconverted? The Burnt Over District of western New York because of the Second Great Awakening. And certainly the biggest players in this were the Baptists and Methodists. And they really grew numerically during this time period. I'll show you a graph in a second. And they brought in lots of new converts. But there were a couple other distinctive American movements. The Campbellite movement, the liberal version of that is called the Disciples of Christ today. The more conservative version of that is the Churches of Christ. Campbellite started out as part of the Second Great Awakening. And the Millerites that would later morph into the Seventh-day Adventists also started out during this time period. So very distinctive American religions starting out during the Second Great Awakening period. So here's a graph here. Blue is Methodist and green is Baptist. And so rapid purple is Episcopalian. And we grow a little tiny bit in our sliver. But you just look at this during this period, this Great Awakening period, the two of these just really start exploding. So lots of very impressive missionary work done by these particular groups.
Sir?
Yes, Bob.
So we see growth of denominations as part of that, the organic growth of the population going from fairly minimal in 1780 to substantial.
Part of that is the American population going there, but if you look at the slice of the pie too, I mean, there are lots of, we think of America being, a Christian country, and our founders were certainly Christians of a sort, no doubt. There are Christian principles enshrined in our founding documents. On the other hand, on the frontier, a lot of folks didn't go to church. First of all, there weren't a lot of churches, and these were kind of cussed, rugged, independent, swarthy characters oftentimes, and they may not be the kind of church-going folks you'd usually expect. What's the line from Paint Your Wagon? Ben Rumson, when I see a parson, I got to put my arse in a wagon and follow the, I've got to get out of town whenever a parson shows up. That's civilization. And certainly population is probably part of this, but it also is an untapped mission field. These folks were unchurched. Really, the biggest percentage-wise, we actually had a bubble in this country. We've had a lot of unchurched folks for our entire history in this country. And we don't think of it this way. The big exception of that is the 1950s and 60s. We had an explosion in Christianity then, and it was almost really like a real estate bubble or a dot-com bubble or anything else. It is kind of reduced back down to more normal American levels now. So now we're below where we probably were in the 40s, 30s, all that, but we're actually not that much different. I was reading an article that we're really not that much different from the 1890s in the early 21st century as far as percentage of people that show up in church on Sunday, which is kind of fascinating. But kudos to the Baptists and Methodists here during this time. All right, Episcopalian, some growth, but late. So Renee had that question. So we're going to talk about the 1830s, but even by 1850, this is the map of Episcopal churches by county, number of Episcopal churches by county. And the darker the area, the more the Episcopal churches. And even in 1850, we're still hugging the coast. I mean, we were the Church of England. We made some inroads into the West, but we didn't do it fast. We were not fast out of the chute at all. In fact, we have a group in our church called the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society that was formed in 1821. In the 1830s, General Convention met 1835 and said, we got a big problem. We got trouble in River City. We are not doing well here. And so they made a bold move. They decided that instead of having a missionary organization called the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society that people would not pay attention to, they were going to make every member of the Episcopal Church a part of the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. If you look at some checks and some of our finances and things, they still have DFMS on them today. That is one of our official names, is the DFMS, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. So it was kind of a late come to Jesus moment for the Episcopal Church, but they did start thinking about mission in America and elsewhere, overseas and far off foreign countries. And so in 1838, we actually sent out our first missionaries as American Episcopalians to the far off, distant, wild and woolly Republic of Texas. That was the first place. And certainly by the 1850s, it's kind of hard to see, but there were Episcopal churches established in Texas on that graph. And I'll put a plug in. Up here on the high plains, we're not as numerous as a percentage of the population, but the largest domestic diocese now in the Episcopal Church is the Diocese of Texas, which is Waco, Tyler, Houston, Austin. So Diocese of Texas has passed New York, passed Virginia, passed Boston in my lifetime, basically since I've been a priest almost probably, they're experiencing some growth down in that part of the world. Still second to Haiti. Haiti is part of the Episcopal Church. It's one of our few foreign churches that are left. We've spun off most of our daughter churches to be independent. When I was a kid, the Church of Mexico was still part of our church. They're independent now. So anyway, we've spun off a lot of our mission fields to be independent daughter churches, sister churches. But Diocese of Texas is the largest in the country now. And if you're curious, there's the list in order. So Texas, which is Southeast Texas, is the largest. Virginia, which is the central part around Richmond, is the second biggest. Diocese of Massachusetts, which is the eastern half of the state. Boston is next. Then New York City, the Diocese of New York, which is the city, but not Long Island. LA speaks for itself. Connecticut, that's the entire state. Atlanta, Diocese of Atlanta is just northern Georgia. North Carolina, that's the middle chunk. There are two other dioceses, East Carolina and Western North Carolina, and Diocese of Long Island. If you want to know where we rank, we'd have to really extend the list down. We're 81st out of the 99 domestic dioceses in Northwest Texas. So that's where the Episcopal Church is strongest today. Much of it on the East Coast, but some in the South. And Atlanta's not East Coast. Georgia, was a traditional colony, but Atlanta certainly was inland. Los Angeles certainly far inland, and Texas certainly inland. So, all right. Also, back to the old joke about the Episcopalians waiting for Pullman car service. We've got a really noticeable exception. We have a Johnny Appleseed of a bishop in our history named Jackson Kemper. Amazing missionary bishop. So in 1835, when they were talking about sending foreign missionaries out and being domestic and foreign missionary society, they appointed him to basically plant churches in the Northwest, which is everything on the other side of the Appalachians, north of the Mason-Dixon line. So he did. He traveled for 24 years before he settled down and became Bishop of Wisconsin. And so he planted churches in Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota. He also, for grins, went down to Oklahoma and did some services down there. So, he just wide-ranging guy, just amazing missionary guy. And he said, we don't need these mamby-pamby clergy. We don't need to be sending guys from Boston or New York. They're going to be too soft for the frontier. He raised up guys on the frontier and ordained them to be priests for these areas. So, yeah, Trey.
Did he travel with an entourage, or was he alone?
He did both, but he would be on horseback most of the time. I mean, he really was a Johnny Appleseed type. He'd go into towns and try to pull congregations together. Oh, we got 2 Episcopalians. Well, let's get about 15 more if we can. Let's grow that way. And he was very effective. Jimmy.
Is he one of the people on the stained glass?
I don't think not expressly, but there is a bishop on horseback on the stained glass, so it could stand in for many bishops, including Kemper. All right, before we get away from the Second Great Awakening, there's one other American group that comes out of this time period, and I do want to mention them. Are they part of Christian history or not? Well, that is actually a live question. It's very hotly debated here. But they did form in the 1820s, 1830s in the Burnover district of upstate New York. And that is the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. So their story, 1820, 15-year-old guy, Joseph Smith, said he had a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ appearing in 2 bodies as 2 separate people to him, told him that every other church in the world was wrong, and that he needed to get things, that every other religious faith had turned aside from the gospel. Try to make this quick. So 1823, several years after that, he had another vision. An angel named Moroni appeared to him with some gold plates with writing, plus some kind of device with some kind of seer stones, that 2 glass things that you could look through, and they put them in some kind of frame like a pair of glasses, and supposedly you could put those on and translate what was on these gold tablets. He kept asking to take those home and to translate them, and the angel kept saying, no, can't do it. I'm not going to trust you with them. But after 5 years of off and on visions of this angel, the angel did, he reports, let him take him home. He did, with the help of a couple other guys, translate these tablets. And what they purported to say was published in 1830 as the Book of Mormon. Book of Mormon is all about a group of Jews who leave Israel after during the Babylonian exile, and a group of them eventually make their way to the Americas, and they later become Native Americans. And 6 centuries later, Jesus appears to them right after his resurrection and teaches them. That's a Mormon painting there. They've got kind of a pyramid, Aztec type or Mayan type pyramid there, and Jesus appearing to Native Americans. Okay, so that's the Mormon story, the Book of Mormon. What happened with this group? He did make converts, a number of them, and traditional Christians thought this was too odd, that he was kind of out of bounds for traditional Christianity. They did experience a fair amount of persecution because of that. They moved out of New York, kept moving west. Smith was eventually shot and killed by a mob in Illinois. One of his assistants, Brigham Young, took the bulk of the group and headed west off the map into a place called Utah, not knowing that was soon going to be a state, but it wasn't at the time to kind of set up. Yeah.
Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered.
Was he tarred and feathered
No, at some point.
at some point? I wouldn't be.
I thought that's what you told me.
Yeah, I thought he was tarred and feathered, and
Survived.
that's how he died.
Oh.
Okay,
I don't know.
tarring. Well, we can look that up. Tarring and feathering, wasn't always fatal. Low temperature. Yeah.
Said that there were 2 people helping translate that. Were they 2 young people?
Yeah, he had I think, I'm not deep on Mormon history. I think he had a falling out with one of them and then replaced the guy, kind of like a secretary writing things down. And I think he went through 2 of these guys. But they are known. And the Mormons claim that there were witnesses that saw, they have a list of witnesses in the Book of Mormon that saw the tablets and the glasses, supposedly. So you can go. I mean, they have a big museum of this in Salt Lake City. I've dragged the kids to that. And on the first floor is Old Testament, New Testament stuff, and then down the lower level is the Mormon stuff, which is different.
Had a child that wanted to argue with him down there.
Yeah, it's a good thing we reined the boy in, which was good.
They weren't telling the story correctly.
Well, there was a couple of girls that actually they didn't know what they were talking about with Abraham, but anyway, and Jimmy was correct, but I'm glad we didn't engage on that one there. So, so one of the big questions here is Mormonism, are Latter-day Saints? Oh, by the way, some stay behind in Missouri. I was going to mention that. Independence, Missouri, they thought was the location of the Garden of Eden. And there still is a Reformed Church of Latter-day Saints or something similar there. And, I had a friend who was a priest in Missouri, and that was just over the line from Kansas. And so I visited that church, and I thought, well, my goodness, if the Mormons are kind of off the scope of normality for Christians, what's this splinter group going to be like? And actually, I was kind of surprised. They actually tacked back towards more traditional Christianity. So they had some Mormon stuff, but it wasn't near as extreme as the Utah group. Yeah, Trey.
So do they have multiple deities? I mean, the Reformed group?
That I'd have to look up. It's been a while since I visited
Well,
that.
the one that came to my door years ago, they explained to me that there's 3 gods.
Well, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are separate people. They're not one in any. They are. So they're not Trinitarian in the normal sense. And because of that, what do you do if somebody Mormon wants to become an Episcopalian? I've only had to deal with that one time, but I've had other clergy that have had to deal with that. Our church actually has no explicit teaching on that. They leave it up priest by priest, but there are a number of groups in our orbit that say explicitly Mormon baptism is not valid. The Methodists, the Evangelical Lutherans, who we're in full communion with, the Presbyterians, and the Roman Catholic Church all say if a Mormon shows up, you need to rebaptize them. What I did in this case is I had a private baptism and conditionally baptized the person. You can always do conditional baptism if somebody's record's burned and they're not sure if they're baptized or not. I think I'm baptized, but I'm not sure. Well, we can do a conditional baptism.
just in case.
Bob, if you're not already baptized, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There we go. Okay. So that's what I would tend to do. And most clergy I know would tend to do that, but that's not, we don't have a hard and fast rule. I kind of view the Mormons, they view themselves as a group within Christianity. I view them as a separate world religion. We have some overlap. We share the Old Testament, the New Testament together, but I think there's enough differences that they're a separate world religion. We share overlap with the Jews. We share the Old Testament with them, but we're not Jewish in a strict sense. We have some things in common, but there's enough differences. I think they're a separate group.
Roseanne used to get mad at me because when we drive past the Mormon church, I'd say heretics. Because some of the stuff they teach would be considered heresy, would it not?
From a traditional Christian standpoint, yes, yeah. The church fathers would not like Mormonism at all. All right. Well, let's move on to something less controversial like slavery and abolitionism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Certainly, it's still a live question in our culture, and we could spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to try to be a little quicker on this. I will say that in all denominations in the Americas, Episcopalians, Baptists, whatever, you had clergy and you had theologians on both sides that made arguments for and against slavery, which made it extremely controversial. I mean, I think of Phillips Brooks, Bishop of Massachusetts, preached Lincoln's funeral, wrote A Little Town of Bethlehem, but he went to seminary just in Virginia, and he got along with his buddies great in class until this issue came up, and then just huge disagreements pre-Civil War going to seminary in Virginia. So you had clergy and theologians on both sides making arguments for and against slavery. We talked about the so-called curse of Ham when we did the Old Testament last year. Noah's son, and supposedly because Ham saw his father naked or had sex with his father, he was cursed, and somehow that got transferred on to every African person in the world, and that justifies slavery for, it's a pretty weak proof text, I think, if you're going to justify. There certainly are slaves in all kinds of cultures, including in the biblical world, but really not kind of brutal slavery we had, especially in South Carolina. South Carolina imported slavery from the Caribbean, and it was especially a brutal form. But having said that, and we forget this, slavery was all up and down the East Coast for the founding part of all 13 colonies had slaves in them early on. It was later they started sorting out more. Yeah, Trey.
Sorry to keep interrupting. We went to North Carolina several years ago and stopped at this old plantation, Somerset,
Uh-huh.
and nice buildings and all that stuff, miserably hot. But they told us that they were Episcopalians, and so their slaves were Episcopalians too, and that family and their workers and their slaves together formed the largest congregation in North Carolina. At
Wow.
one point.
Wow. That's pretty wild. I've been to some of those churches, and, the slaves would sit up in the balcony, and, the folks would sit down the floor, and they'd keep them segregated that way. Just to deal with some complexities, I just want to mention two Episcopal clergymen dealing with this issue, Absalom Jones and Leonidas K. Polk. So kind of the two ends of the spectrum here. So Absalom Jones was a slave in Philadelphia, freed in 1784. Again, Benjamin Franklin, if you've watched that new Ken Burns documentary, he talks about his slaves and his struggles with slavery. So Absalom Jones, not related to Franklin at all, but he was a slave freed in the early days of America at age 38, 1784. And 20 years later, at age 58, he was ordained as the first Black priest in the Episcopal Church, first African-American priest, and really the first in any major denomination. So kind of a seminal figure. He wasn't put in charge of an Anglo congregation. He was ordained in order to have a Black congregation in Philadelphia. So it was still very segregated, but 1804, that's still fairly remarkable, having a Black priest in the church. On the other end of the spectrum is Bishop Leonidas Polk. He was a West Point grad who gave up the military and became Bishop of Louisiana. And then in the Civil War, he decided he'd give up being Bishop of Louisiana and rejoin the military, and he became a Confederate general. Battle of Shiloh, he was killed outside of Atlanta and all those campaigns in 1864. Not a very good general. I remember reading one historian that said, one of the worst shots ever taken by a Union soldier was the one that killed Leonidas Polk because he was so inept. It would have been much better to keep him alive and active by taking him out and actually help the Confederacy and hurt the Union. Anyway, but I mean, that's pretty extreme spectrum there, from Absalom Jones to Leonidas Polk, and there was all kinds of things in between. Yeah, Bob.
And All Saints Chapel at Sewanee, there's one of the stained glass windows depicts Polk with his bishop's vestments with a Confederate uniform underneath.
As you might imagine, Polk's paintings and stained glass window at Sewanee are very controversial right now, and that university is having to deal with what do we do about this part of our legacy?
Well, another one of the relics is supposedly Nathan, because Nathan Bedford Forrest was the first vice chancellor.
Of Sewanee.
And one of the ceremonial items they had was theoretically his mace.
Okay.
That used to always be carried in convocations.
Robert, we have a lot of, Robert E. Lee is a very faithful Episcopalian. I mean, so, it's kind of a struggle to deal with some of these things. But, the Episcopal Church is not alone in that. In fact, just about every American group had to deal with it. Some groups split and reunited. Some groups split and never got back together. So examples, the Methodists split into a North and South branch, and they didn't get back together until 1939. That took a while. The Baptists still have not reunited. There is an American Baptist Church, which is Northern Baptist, and a Southern Baptist Church, which is a very strong, huge denomination, still divided to this day. That slavery caused that divide. We actually were pretty lucky. We navigated it well. There was a Confederate Episcopal Church. They formed a separate church, had a prayer book. You can find copies of that. Oftentimes when you go to some Civil War fort or battlefield, they might have a copy of the Confederate Book of Common Prayer. But the thing that helped us is the Northern bishops never recognized that split. And so when they would meet during the Civil War, they'd call the roll. Bishop of Alabama? Absent. Bishop of Arkansas? Absent. Bishop of Connecticut? Present. Bishop of Delaware? Present. Bishop of Georgia? So they kept calling the roll and just marking the guys absent during the Civil War. And so it was actually easier for us as a group to get back together because of that afterwards. We were able to reunify much quicker than some other groups. And probably the last thing I want to say about this, our great theologian, President Lincoln, his second inaugural address 6 weeks before his death, he's talking in religious terms about the Civil War and its meaning. Famous words. And I love the first line there that I've quoted, neither party, neither side expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which is already attained. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. How can both sides have God on their side? And then the wonderful line, that of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. And then his wrap-up statement, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills it continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Elsewhere, Lincoln, they asked him, do you want to, is God on our side? And he says, well, I'd rather be on God's side than God being on my side. Both read the same Bible, both invoke God's aid. The prayers of neither could be answered fully. All right. Before I get off this, anything else? All right. Well, let's deal with some more controversial stuff in America. So some other controversies came out of European scholarship, and they didn't cause ripples in America when they happened. We were dealing with the Civil War. We were dealing with Reconstruction. And so the ripples would ripple in our culture later on. But you did have natural selection and evolution from England, and you had higher biblical criticism from Germany during the 19th century. So I want to talk about both of those briefly here. So Britain, Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species 1859 and on the Descent of Man 1871. And in Britain at the time, there were a lot of debates. There was some Church of England, our mother church, priests that took both sides of those debates. Some argued for a theistic understanding of evolution, that God is somehow using evolution to create things. And others said, nope, it's incompatible with Scripture. But really didn't hit our American radar screen so much because we were dealing with other issues. That would be a later controversy in America, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Also during this time, overlapping it and going past it quite a bit, was what is called higher biblical criticism. This especially came out of Germany in the 19th century. Scholars were developing tools to look at old manuscripts and to look at other documents, documents by Socrates and Aristotle, and trying to figure out how old they were, and using all these tools to understand them better. And in the 19th century, they said, well, what about turning these tools toward Scripture and seeing what happens? And I will say that their agendas were mixed. Some were very, very faithful people, and some were blatantly atheist. And so their agendas would often color what their results would be from this. So some wanted to undermine traditional Christianity using these tools, and some wanted to bolster Christianity using these tools. And I would say that some of the insights still survive. The fact that it's most likely that Mark is the earliest gospel. That was something that was really kind of undiscovered till they really turned the tools onto looking at the four gospels in great detail. And it looks like Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark, and they also drew on another source. There's stuff that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark. There's some other source out there. We have no idea what it is, but there are stories that both Matthew and Luke use. Luke talks about investigating all these accounts and trying to draw together a coherent account. So, Luke talks about having other things that he's pulling together into his gospel. So some of those insights are very helpful today, and some of them are very much part of traditional biblical scholarship, even at LCU, a very conservative group, but some of this higher biblical criticism is still used today by those groups. Others is less useful, and some has kind of faded into the dustbin of history. Yeah, Trey.
How do the really conservative side of biblical criticism, how do they accept this idea that pieces of the Old Testament are from different eras and merged together?
That was part of what came out of some of that. Yeah.
Do they accept it, or they say, no, it's all like this?
It depends on, I certainly, would say that there are helpful pieces from that. That the Old Testament was probably, has many different authors that came together, even the 5 books of Moses. There are some that would say no and reject that still. So,
As I understand it, most, I think even conservative seminaries are starting to, the academics are starting to push that, so so new pastors are being taught that now. So I think it's becoming less and less of an issue.
less controversial after 150 years. It's starting to be, these things are hypothetical. The idea of there being a source that Matthew and Luke draw on, we don't have a copy of it. And so it is hypothetical, but over 150 years, it seems to hold up as something that's a helpful tool. So, and the same with some of those Old Testament controversies.
But it could also have been something that's just oral.
It could have been completely oral and not written. Yeah. Could have been a tradition source that was oral. Yeah. Source, Kara. All right. Now, there was some American pushback to this. Higher biblical criticism made some folks nervous, and evolution made some folks nervous. And so a group arose in America that said, no, there are certain fundamentals that we're going to adhere to in opposition to this new stuff that's dangerous. And they were eventually called fundamentalists. The fundamentals were a series of tracts, 12 volumes. You can actually get them bound in 2 or 3 volumes now. But the short list, if you really boil it down, the number one thing is that the Bible is inerrant meaning without error. And plus literal understandings of the virgin birth of Jesus, his sacrificial death, his physical resurrection, and his second coming. As a more conservative Episcopalian, I would actually agree with all these fundamentals, except I don't view the Bible as inerrant. I view the Bible as the word of God. But to claim that any document is without error makes me nervous, just like the Roman Catholics make me nervous when they claim that the Pope's pronouncements are without error.
Infallible is a little bit different. The
and-
Bible can be infallible, but
But it's,
yeah, but it's still.
right. I think God has given us what we're supposed to have for salvation in it. But does that mean that every gospel account has to be blended so that the number of angels at the tomb is exactly the same? No, they're different in different gospels. Different witnesses give different testimony in court all the time when they see the same event. So I have no problem with that kind of thing. But if you're strictly saying that the Bible's without error, I would say I don't go that far. But I have no problem with the virgin birth, Jesus's atoning death, resurrection, second coming. Some more liberal Christians see those more metaphorically, including some of my dear seminary classmates. In fact, one of my more liberal classmates got in trouble because she was a fairly liberal congregation, and she preached an Easter sermon about how important the resurrection of Jesus was as a real thing. And her congregation was, "What? Are you some kind of fundamentalist wacko?" Well, Deborah is not fundamentalist by any stretch of the imagination. She is well to my left. But Trey, go ahead.
So as far as what they thought was fundamental things you had to believe or had to accept.
Right.
Is it limited to this?
No, this is the core.
Yeah.
There'll be some other things too, but so famous cartoon here, The Descent of the Modernists. So if you look up here, you start with Christianity, and then you take a step down by saying the Bible is not inerrant and not infallible. And so actually, I'm standing kind of on this step up here. I don't think that being one step down means you have to take the whole staircase. But it's kind of the camel getting its head in the tent idea here. The Bible is not infallible. Man's not made in God's image. No miracles, no virgin birth, no deity. God's not a deity, or Christ is not a deity, I guess. No atonement, no resurrection. And that puts you at agnosticism and then atheism at the very bottom. And it's also funny, the guy's kind of got a book or a Bible here, and then as he descends, he's got a scientific flask. Being a chemistry major, I kind of don't like that, but anyway. But that's a good essence of fundamentalism. Their concerns. Once you start down this staircase, it leads you to atheism at the very bottom here.
When Thomas Jefferson did his,
Right.
what, all this, did he, miracles are one thing.
Oh, Jefferson would probably be floating around somewhere down here near the agnostic step. Jefferson was not a theist in the same way we understand it. He did not believe in miracles, including the virgin birth, the resurrection, all that. So yeah, he would be, but that was an early Enlightenment thing, not biblical criticism. Jefferson would have actually loved some of the biblical criticism that came out later.
He died before that.
Long before that, yeah. All right, one thing that I do push back on with this fundamentalist versus modernist controversy, when you get into this debate, when they are debating each other, kind of the extremists on both ends, they are both privileging history as the deciding factor. Everything else stands or falls whether things are historically true or not. And so one group will say it's not true historically, therefore it's not true spiritually. And the other group says it is true spiritually, therefore it has to be true historically. And I would push back and say, I don't have to read Genesis as strict history in order for it to be true. The two accounts of creation, I think, are extremely true theologically. Just like I believe the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the Good Samaritan are extremely true theologically, even though those are stories Jesus used to tell things about God's love and God's nature. So, but both really their history is becoming the be all end all judge of things during this time period for both sides. And I think that was a tactical mistake.
And history like we know it was a new thing.
And history was just barely being invented like we knew it in the 1870s. So yeah. All right, real quick, I want to mention the Scopes monkey trial, 1925, a little past our purview here. But if you've seen the movie Inherit the Wind, it's a wonderful movie, but it's absolutely horrible history. They pull the court transcripts out and use those, but they change everybody's name because they are not following history at all. They've got the teacher arrested and persecuted by the community. Scopes was volunteered by his superintendent in the local chamber of commerce, basically in Dayton, Tennessee. They wanted a test case. ACLU was going to foot the bill. They asked him to voluntarily do that. They were sitting around drinking coffee, basically, and saying, how can we get some more money flowing into Dayton? Well, let's have a test case, and maybe people will come here and for the trial. And so, Scopes, would you do it? Did you even teach evolution? Well, I'm not sure if I did or not. Well, say you did, and we'll put you on trial. And so they briefly arrested him, booked him, and then let him go. So it was something that, he wasn't being persecuted by his town at all, which is hugely different in the movie. 2 American Titans came. Clarence Darrow, the famous trial lawyer and a noted agnostic, one of the founders of the ACLU, is on one side. He's on the left there. William Jennings Bryan, 3-time presidential candidate, progressive Democrat, interestingly, Secretary of State. He earlier had been a theistic evolutionist, but because of kind of the brutality involved with evolution, pushed away from that later on in his life. And so he was on the prosecution side. So these 2 hugely famous Americans show up in this little Tennessee town. One of the first great media circuses in history. They broadcast this thing on the radio. They were telegraphing live reports, all kinds of reporters. In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined, but then it was overturned on a technicality, and that was the end of that. But it was not, we kind of have it in our mythology that was faith persecuting science. It was a test case that everybody was in on at the time. One thing that I do want to talk about is something called social Darwinism. And that was something that Darwin himself was very much against. Darwin is actually thinking about being an Episcopal priest, Anglican priest, also thinking about being a physician, but decided in college not to pursue either of those 2. But he was worried about social Darwinism, applying natural selection, which happens within species of lower animals and even human ancestors, applying that to the social world today, saying that it's okay for the strong to prey on the weak. It's okay for a stronger country to attack a weaker country, to kill weaker people, whatever. That's just survival of the fittest. That's how Darwinism works. And so he pushed against that. But there were groups in the 20th century that applied Darwinianism from this social standpoint. The Nazis famously did that. And when kind of the results of the Nazi Holocaust came to light, social Darwinism started to really kind of fade from favor at that point, become really disreputable. But it was, and there were even in our beloved country, there were forced sterilization movements that people were pushing. We really should sterilize anybody who's a criminal or mentally retarded or whatever we deem as wrong to protect the species. That's how we stay strong. So that was big at the turn of the century and then faded after that. All right, that was a lot, y'all. Next week, we're not meeting because we're having Easter brunch. We'll pick up in 2 weeks with missionary work from Britain and America especially. Any really quick thoughts or questions here? Yeah, Gordon.
The reason is for the rapid growth of the Mormon church in this day and age?
I think part of the reason is they are really efficient in sending out missionaries. I mean, they have mandatory service. All their youth go out. They train them well. They train them to go into whatever culture they're going into. And they really school their kids on what the core of the faith is. And then they send them out 2 by 2, like Jesus says, to do that. And, for folks that are unchurched, that's probably attractive. And, the way they emphasize family values, I think that's attractive to many people. Certainly, I appreciate their genealogical stuff. As an amateur genealogist, they do some interesting things that are attractive like that. But Trey, did you want to get in on this, or?
Well, yeah, I was just going to mention that they probably, even though people in modern America may grow up in a society that we think is Christian. I know a 31-year-old guy from Florida. Family went to the Episcopal church. He went to an Episcopal school. I was talking to him yesterday on the phone. He lives in Maryland now. And I said something, he said, I've got to work. And I said, well, what do you, your boss is heathens or something? Tomorrow's Palm Sunday. He goes, what is that?
Hmm.
I had no idea what it was. He'd heard of it, but he didn't know what it was.
Post-Christian.
And so I spent like 45 minutes talking to him about, this is what this is.
Well, certainly the mission field is ripe in America now. There are plenty of unchurched people. And so the Mormons are certainly, and not only in America, they're around the world. They are expanding tremendously. Abby, go ahead.
Just another thought about Mormons. Once you get into the Mormon church, they're segmented into wards, and those are their groups. And everybody does stuff together in the wards. You touch base with everybody else once a week. If you're sick and not in church, then somebody's calling you or checking on you. But the bounds are so tight once you're in that particular faith that they really don't let you go. And I guess it's a good feeling if you felt rejected other places. You're so accepted in this group.
And that's hard to break out of if you're trying to get out, and that can be a problem too. We've got Deacon in Abilene, who was a former grew up Mormon, but on the other hand, that kind of small group ministry is something other churches try to replicate and they've got it built in and cooked into their system in a very strong way. So yeah, it's good. Trey.
Probably something else that's somewhat attractive is to people is that their path to salvation involves, at least in part, earning it. You got to behave in a particular way. I have a friend who's Mormon. When his mother died, he said, if anybody should ever go to heaven, it's my mother, because she was so wonderful.
Mm.
And I didn't say anything to him, but
Yeah.
it disturbs me that.
Grace is not the operative term in that. Yeah. And that earning salvation. In fact, part of your salvation, as I understand it, is you can get your planet, and you can rule over the planet. So, hey, that's kind of cool, actually.
As weird as some of that stuff is, I mean, and it is weird. I told one, 500 years ago, you'd have been marked at the stake for teaching this. Not that I was supporting that,
Right.
but that's what would have happened to you. But they make great neighbors. They're great to have in your community because they're just good.
Hard working,
Good
good
citizens.
citizens. Yeah.
I mean, and the door-to-door thing,
Right.
we have had over the years in Ottawa, like 4 times, people come to sell us home security systems. Every one of them is LDS. And the last one who came by said, why is it that all these guys are LDS? He goes, well, because we're trained going door to door. They know we know how
No,
to do it. Oh, yeah, that's true.
on the job training. Well, that's funny. All right, we'll pick up in 2 weeks. Good to see everybody.
Cold call.
Cold call.
I had something. I let him in the house. I let him in the house.